Got it.
There's a couple of people joining us, and then there's one that's just a number. I can't let people in if they're anonymous. So unfortunately,
That's Rich Jensen.
okay, thank you.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Happy New Year to everybody. So the planning board was just in executive session to discuss a litigation matter. We have come out. We're back in public session. If anybody was here for 55 South Main Street, that matter has been postponed to January 25th because a deadline was missed by the applicant, and we couldn't notice it in time for tonight's meeting, so it's been moved to the 25th. Otherwise, we have no other hearings tonight. We just have some other planning board business we are going to discuss. The first thing being, Lauren is going to give us an update on the status of the MBTA multifamily legislation and where our town stands with that. And then the board just has some internal business, some updates from some of our subcommittees and approval of our schedule for 2023. And that's pretty much all we're going to be doing tonight. If any of you have a particular question, I noticed a number of you I can recognize it from the neighborhood around Jerusalem Road Estates. I can't tell you what happened during the executive session, but it's probably known that the town, the planning board and the town clerk have been, there was an appeal of some decisions that we made in 2021 or two, early 2022. And that's litigation is ongoing. And there's, well, it's just ongoing. There's nothing to report about it one way or the other. So I can't answer anything more about it, but yes, Katie Dugan.
Katie Dugan, 100 Black Rock Road. You're right, there are people on from the neighborhood. We did take notice of the executive session hearing tonight on the Jerusalem Roads Estate, something that we as a neighborhood broadly from Black Rock to Jerusalem to Windy Hill are very interested in following. We did do our research and go back and look at land court records. So we've read the motions. We understand that discovery, at least phase 1, has been completed, and there's a hearing with the magistrate on January 9th. One question is whether those hearings with the magistrate, they appear to be telephonic. Is that something that the neighborhood can participate and listen into so we can follow the litigation more closely?
You would have to ask the land court specifically, but all court proceedings are open to the public. Certainly Zoom ones are and live ones are. I don't know how they handle it by telephone when members of the public. And the thing on the 9th is a status conference. There's been a couple that have been scheduled in the case. Discovery is not complete, by the way, but you know, the judge is going to ask where everybody stands on discovery, on other matters. And, you know, I don't know that it'll be, you probably won't find anything substantive decided at a status conference. That's not what the point of it is supposed to be. But if you know the phone number to call in, you probably can do that. But the judge
It's posted publicly. So, you know, you can download a document that gives you all the information. So
yeah, it's probably no different than participating in a Zoom conference, but I can tell you at a status conference, if you're not a party to the litigation, you won't be heard.
no, I understand.
Judge won't entertain anything anybody has to say, but whether you can listen in, that's probably fine because all court hearings are public.
Okay. All right. Well, we appreciate the town continuing to pursue this. Obviously, it's something that we are focused on as a community and a neighborhood, but I understand that you can't comment on active litigation.
No, so. All right. Well, you're welcome to stick around for our other boring internal topics, but otherwise, again, anybody who was here for 55 South Main, we'll see you on the 25th. All right, so without further ado, Lauren, if you want to bring us up to date on what's going on with the housing choice legislation. And for those of you in the public who are here, and for the members, this is the legislation that the state has passed in 2022 that states that towns within a certain perimeter around an MBTA station have to develop provide the zoning for. They don't have to develop the projects, but they have to provide the zoning for a certain amount and density of multifamily housing projects. So, Lauren.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually review a presentation that was given to the select board in November, on November 29th, 2022, because it's a lot of the same information. And I haven't had a chance to really brief the planning board on this yet, other than sending you some attachments. So some of this might be repetitive for you. You may have seen it already. But again, we're just going to get into this and then I'll explain more as we go along. It's going to be hard for me to share my screen, and also see all of you. So if anybody has a question, just call out because I might not see you. So, all right, so I'm going to go into a quick overview of affordable housing, some general terms. I'm going to talk about 40B quickly and the subsidized housing inventory before I really get into the MBTA multifamily zoning mandate, because a lot of these topics and themes that you'll see are somewhat related. For anybody listening or anybody who's just looking for a refresher, these are some of the buzzwords you'll see. Is someone asking a question?
Mark, do you have your hand up?
Nope.
Mark?
Okay,
Nope.
thanks. So Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, you'll hear us use that acronym a lot. That is the state branch, if you will, of all things affordable and housing development. Subsidized housing inventory falls under the purview of the Department of Housing and Community Development, and it is really just a percentage, it's a count of deed restricted affordable housing units that are eligible for individuals earning a specific area mean income of 80%. There is an opportunity to have some things be lower, but generally when you talk about SHI eligible units, they're deed restricted at an 80% AMI area. The subsidized housing inventory is calculated based on taking the entire count of a year of a community's decennial census housing count. So that's why we use every 10 years you get a census update and you see your SHI number get updated, because they're constantly using that as your total unit count. However, the numbers that you use on the subsidized housing inventory can be updated as the town adds them online. And what you'll see every year is that DHCD issues a biennial update. So approximately roughly every 2 years, they just resend out their updated data counts with the updated SHI units, still using whatever was the last decennial census figure as the bottom of that mathematical equation to figure out what your percentage is. When we talk about Chapter 40B is the most sort of recent, I would say, state law that really impacted a lot of affordable housing trends. And it was circa 80s. It was a state statute that required that all communities in the Commonwealth have 10% on that SHI. That would include, these deed restricted affordable housing units. They talk about a safe harbor, which is when a community has either reached their 10% or you can achieve it temporarily by using, certain calculations. If you have a housing production plan that is both approved and certified by the state, those are two levels of approval. Certification is when you're actually making active progress on your subsidized housing inventory count by adding trackable percent increases. A lot of figures and formulas to go into what safe harbor means, but there is a way to do it temporarily if you haven't reached 10% permanently.
And we have a housing production plan
We do.
that's been approved.
Correct.
Yep.
Quickly, just a couple more terms. Comprehensive permitting is something that you'll hear about. It's often 40B. People think 40B is just affordable housing development. It's referring shorthand. Chapter 40B is the state law, and comprehensive permitting is a permitting process that's enabled through Chapter 40B. It allows, in a lot of circumstances, developments to go to the local zoning board and potentially override certain zoning characteristics and dimensions if they have this affordable housing component. And oftentimes what you'll see is they give, if it's an unfriendly 40B and it's, something that the town did not initiate with the developer, and it was developer initiated and the town has not met their 10%, it ultimately starts at the local zoning board, but there is a path to move forward up to a state housing appeals committee. So they do give the municipalities the first sort of bite at the apple at reviewing this project, but you'll often see that, a development may not be happy with what the local decision was and they will appeal up the state. And that's where you can see this sort of override of local zoning. We talk about big A versus little a affordable. Big A simply means that it's that deed restricted criteria for the SHI, whereas lowercase affordable is just something that is more naturally occurring affordability levels. That's not necessarily a deed restriction. We talk about 40R, that's a smart growth overlay zoning district act through the state that encourages smart growth in different affordable housing principles. And through that 40R program, they eventually added on a 40S program, which is a provision that allows the municipalities that are seeing an increase in school children because of these 40R districts to tap into a funding resource that will help them offset costs for public schools and things of that nature and the impacts of those school age children. Moving on to our subsidized housing inventory, as I mentioned earlier, this is calculated by taking your SHI eligible unit count of deed restricted units and dividing by your total year-round housing units from the last official decennial census. We have been using 2010 for a long time now because 2020 census was delayed. At this point, 2020 census figures have been released piecemeal in pieces, but the figure that they use to update the subsidized housing inventory has not been released in its final count. So until that is done and they have a time to update it at the federal and state level, we will continue to see them using the 2010 census figures. We had been anticipating late 2022 for this to be happening. So now that we're in early 2023, maybe we'll see an update soon. But in the meantime, I'm using projected 2020 census figures to calculate what we're looking at for our projection in our SHI. And the number that I'm using when I say projected 2020 census figures is a number that came from the MBTA multifamily legislation. They give us an estimated 2020 housing units per a 2020 census figure. So if it's good enough for them to use it for their calculations, I think it's pretty safe for us to use for our calculation. We had previously we've had 307 subsidized housing inventory units on our SHI. We still currently have that number. In the 2010 census, we were looking at 2,898 total units, which gives us a 10.6%, putting us over that 10% threshold and into the safe harbor status. In 2020, using the bottom figure of 3,341, which is what the MBTA multifamily legislation is using for their data figures to tell us what we need to do to comply with this new law, plugging that into the same formula, you see we're projected to fall below 10%. With that said, we knew this was coming in our housing production plan. They had been using census figures from an American Community Survey to sort of give another projection. And they had anticipated that we would be about 25 units short. So now we're getting more of a clear picture that we are going to be a minimum of 28 units short based on what the housing stock that we have right now. The good news is that we have units in the pipeline already. 87 and 89 Cushing Road, actually, since I've last given this presentation in November, we have paperwork in the queue to get those on the subsidized housing inventory. They're already eligible to be doing that. So those 4 units will take up that 307 quite soon. We also have a couple of other projects that you see down the list here. These are all in various stages of either construction or permitting proposal. So roughly you're seeing about 45 units in the next couple of years of development pipeline. And I'll just remind you again that we can find temporary safe harbor by certifying our housing production plan, which would mean making measurable progress. And I don't have the exact figures, but I want to say if we had 14 to 15 units, that would give us that 0.5% to put us into at least a year of temporary safe harbor. The amount that we need to get to full safe harbor is so small that once we get, even if we qualified for a 2-year safe harbor, it would essentially put us into the full 10% anyway. So that's our picture of where we're looking at SHI. Right now, if you look, it'll still say we're at 10.6%. So this 9.2 is just a projection about where we can anticipate once those census figures fall. But right now we're still in safe harbor. Moving on to our next big law is the MBTA multifamily zoning. This is Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A. You may hear a lot of state and technical assistance programs talk about 3A technical assistance. They're not referring to the state highway corridor. They're referring to this law. It's a new piece of the 2021 Housing Choice Initiative through the state. It requires communities to have at least one zoning district with multifamily housing permitted by right. And that's as of, meets a certain bunch of criteria. Failure to comply with the law puts you out on 3 different specific funding programs that they've stated already, but they also have noted and made it abundantly clear that this is a mandate. It's not an opt-in, and that DHCD may in its discretion take into this consideration as they're making other funding awards. The 3 state programs that we know already. There's a special funds account. At first, from finance department discussions that I had, it really wasn't much of an impact on our municipal budget. With that said, I've since seen other Commonwealth states, municipalities, I should say, have had, if they have been falling out of interim compliance, they've had potential threats to their housing authority funding, which is not something that is run through the town. It's really more of a state separate organization. But that is something to be cognizant of, that I don't know the answer to that about what our housing authority uses, if that impact would really impact their budget. So that is something to consider. We do need to explore that facet a bit more. The other two funds are grant programs. One is Housing House Choice. We're not eligible for it anyway because we don't have enough housing production to qualify for that program. And the third one is really the one, the Community One Stop for Growth is a big umbrella of grant programs, including things for infrastructure funding and different planning processes, all sorts of programs that it would borrow us from that. So that is really the biggest that we would see from our previous experiences with these different programs, where we would be feeling a pinch if we were to not be in compliance. This is a slide here that explains why the state is doing this, because the state themselves have explained that the Massachusetts and other state leaders that we're in a housing crisis. We have among the fastest growing and highest home prices and rents of any state in the nation, and that we continue to see exponential increase in rising costs, placing financial pressures on particularly low and middle income families. A lot of times we're seeing people being forced with higher housing costs, forcing them to sacrifice over other priorities to pay the housing costs. And it can be a primary driver of homelessness. And then in addition, when you're thinking about state to state competitiveness, about our state economy, high costs are disadvantages. We compete economically against other states, particularly in this trend post-COVID, as you're seeing flexible work from home and telecommute more common. How does zoning for multifamily help the housing crisis? A lack of zoning is really often a barrier for new development in housing in Massachusetts. By allowing multifamily near transit, we're able to sort of try to build up our housing stock in ways that are smart growth as well, making sure people have access to transportation near schools and jobs that are walkable and efficient. So it really is trying to think about this in a sort of holistic way. They also stress that this is really trying to look at missing middle housing, which is a term we talk about in planning a lot, as there's a lot of opportunities and different typologies of housing in between what you traditionally think about detached single family homes, which is what we are so heavily dominated by, versus these, very dense mid-rise units. You have everything from duplex, triplex, sort of the townhouse and live work areas. Some examples that we have in real life. I actually don't have that screen. Oh, that's in my draft. Some examples that I'll show you in another time that are in my draft for my January 10th presentation, because like where we go around to give examples of what multifamily examples you can think of in our community. One is the transit-oriented development that's right next to the train station on 3A. It's now the Preserve, but it used to be Avalon Bay. That's a multifamily development complex. If you think about, there's down in Situate Harbor, right along Front Street, if anyone's familiar with the Welch Company building, that's a mixed use building. There's residential and condo apartment complex above, a mix of housing typologies. And the same can be said for areas in, Hingham Shipyard, those Avalon complexes and townhomes. These are examples of how we can think about doing multifamily that isn't your typical, what people think of, big box, high rise. Getting more into these regulations and what they say, you need to have multifamily as of right. You can require site plan review. But again, and this is really more for a general public, I know the planning board knows this, but site plan review can be used to regulate matters like vehicular access, circulation, architectural designs, and aesthetics, but you really can't use it to deny a project that's allowed as of right by placing conditions that are impractical or unfeasible to proceed. You also can't place any limits on, you can't do age restrictions. They have to be suitable for families with children. You can't do, solve this by creating zoning for multifamily that's, age restriction, and you can't place limits on numbers of units or bedrooms. Sometimes I've seen in other communities, they do sort of an apartment style where they limit no more than 2 bedrooms per unit. You're not allowed to do that explicitly in this language. And then there's reasonable size and density criteria that I'm not going to get into the level of detail on this because there's a lot of if this and ors, and it gets very complicated, but trust me, on the next slide that I've confirmed, and this is the figures that the state have given us, So,
Excuse me, Lauren, just
Yes.
quickly, on the size of units, like for the village, I think we set a minimum and a maximum for the actual square footage, gross square footage, residential gross floor area. So with this new legislation, you could have a minimum like these micro units that are 400 square feet, or you could have a 5-bedroom that's 4,000 square feet, and the legislation just says you can't have a square footage min max.
right, and it's almost similar to if you think about in some of the projects we've seen before that have been like a friendly 40B in town.
Yeah.
If you look at the split up of units that DHCD will approve, they won't allow you to give all of those inclusionary zoning units as like your smallest units. It's like you have
Right.
to, it's like the same type of complex. They want you to like share and distribute the units. So they don't want to see zoning that's
It's gotta
only
be
ones and
even.
twos or only studios. They want to see a mix of things for different styles of families and different, different sort of groups that may be living together.
Right, if there's a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom, then the affordables wouldn't just be the 1 bedrooms.
Right, exactly. And I mean, there's a lot of sort of things that go into if you're limiting at a 2-bedroom, you may be prohibiting for families with children. They like to see a mix of at the minimum 3 bedrooms in these developments. So these are the kind of caveats that they're looking for to make sure that this is least restrictive as possible. So it's suitable for people of all ages and abilities. So
Thank you.
no problem, thank you. This slide is just really snapshotting what this means for us and the figures. This is the figure 3,341 that I had told you earlier. That's the 2020 housing units that their guidelines are giving us. They calculate our minimum multifamily unit capacity at 638. At first, I did think this was a mistake because that puts us at about 19%, which if you look at our commuter rail designation as a category, you would think our maximum would be 15%. But because they give you, it's either the greater than the calculation, this is because you need to have 15 units per acre density. And then if you go to our minimum land area, it's actually less than, because most communities, it's a 50-acre minimum, but because of our developable land area, they sort of put that on a more to scale for us. So we have our minimum land area is 43 acres, which is less than the 50 acres that is like the standard blanket. That's another one of their, if you don't have this much developable station area, it will be calculated as a percent of that. And that's how they get 43 acres for us. 241 acres is the developable station area in the half-a-mile radius. In the early phases of this legislation and their draft guidelines, they were saying that they wanted like 80% of your district in this half-mile radius. Particularly for example, us, that's not feasible. And they got a lot of pushback from a lot of municipalities saying that. So they have now, kind of changed this so that we only, with the calculations that ours breaks out to, we only have to have 20% of our district located in the station area. I had
That's
at the
just
time,
flexibility in applying the
yes,
guidelines
they've given
based
us
on
more
our
flexibility.
size.
Yes,
Okay.
they've given some more flexibility. So they're
Well,
saying,
it will allow us to look at the whole of 3A from one property town line to the other, rather than just have to concentrate this around the station.
you could, or you could pick select parcels. So for example, what you'll see on this next screen, this is an example that I had given for discussion purposes. This was all just my brain. Nobody told me to pick these parcels. The reason I picked these parcels here was that that you see there, that is the existing TOD site and the land around it, that little sliver half moon, that's the MBTA parking lot. That exactly comes out to about 17.4, which is within the half-mile radius, and gets us to our, 20% would only be 8.6. So that puts us well above our 20% if we zoned that land. We of course know that we need to ultimately hit 43 acres for our combined district areas. So some other parcels that you could just look at for conversational discussion, where I gave option B is the preserve development, which is formerly Avalon Bay. That site in and of itself is almost 43 acres and it's already got multifamily on it. You could rezone that parcel. Oh, here's another important factor. It doesn't matter what's on the ground. It's what is it zoned for. So even though there are 255 housing units at that parcel B right now, they're not looking at any math that's on the ground right now. They want to know what is the zoning that you have and what is the maximum build out capacity under that zoning. that you could fit, and it's got to equal at least 15 units per acre. So we could take the Avalon development parcel, rezone the parcel to be a denser development, and while you may see some infill development, you likely wouldn't see a full build out to capacity at that site, given that it's already developed.
Well, the old Avalon site has some additional development capacity anyway.
Right.
So that makes some sense.
Right. So that's an option. And then the last option I had thrown out was a town-owned parcel. That one, the reason I gave it as an example is because it's over, in a decent area by the school. It's near downtown. It fits with like housing production goals. And at the end of the day, the town select board they're the ownership of that. So nothing can happen at that property, even if they zoned it without their consent. But when I presented this to the select board on the 30th, I was given the green light to continue exploring a draft interim compliance plan for A and B. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing there. And I was hoping to have my presentation for the 10th ready for you tonight, but it just needed some final tweaks. So it'll be done tomorrow. But I plan to come back to the board, and the next thing I'll share with you is just to show you what the interim compliance form means. Because right now, interim compliance, there's a couple of dates here really. Oh, that's their agenda. Okay, hold on. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can find the form, but I'll talk to you while I'm doing that.
And they allow overlay districts, so you can have the base zone plus an overlay district that would be related to the distance to the train station.
And we can use, and
What's
we can
interesting
also,
about our train station is that there's a lot of wetlands around it, a golf course, and it's probably the lowest, other than Avalon, it's probably the lowest density residential area in town.
it also allows us to use mixed use zoning, correct?
It does, yes.
Which is a consideration if we do all of this on 3A, not to completely destroy our commercial tax base in the process.
So I don't have the timeline in front of me, but I'll just quickly review what the timelines and next steps are here. And again, tonight, there's no action that you guys need to take. This is just informative because at some point when we talk zoning, you are all going to be involved. This is just to give you an idea about what's going on at this stage in the process. The commuter rail communities have been given until the end of calendar year 2024, so December of 2024, to have adopted the zoning districts to be in full compliance. In the meantime, we have to submit by the end of this calendar month our draft interim compliance plan, which is a pretty relatively, it's like an online form. There's really not that much information and it's non-committal, but what it does is you map out what you're tentatively thinking. Are you looking at doing 40R? Are you thinking of doing an overlay zoning? Do you have parcels in mind? And what are your timelines that you're looking to do? So I am going to the select board on the 10th. The last time I spoke with them about this was the presentation you just saw in November. They asked me to put this plan together and come back before we submit this in January. So I'm going to return to them on Tuesday with a presentation that's a little bit sort of from that one moving forward. And then we're going to review that form with them. And then if we submit, we'll be in interim compliance until 2024. And what we would aim to do in that scenario is working backwards. We would really want to have that zoning at annual town meeting in the 2024 spring cycle, because if you adopt spring annual town meeting article, you have then 6 months to get that attorney general roughly letter back. You get that back like October, November, and then you can file for December.
I think from the bylaw committee's point of view, we haven't discussed this in general, in detail yet, but we're shooting, this is going to be amongst the many substantive changes of the table, dimensional regulations there, the use regulations. This is probably going to be fall 23 would be our target. At the moment, that would be our target.
It's even sooner.
Yeah, no, it just, what my concern was with that is that, is this interim proposal going to be in conflict with what we might ultimately do? Again, this hasn't been discussed in detail by the bylaw committee or the prior working group, but to the extent there was discussions, I mean, we are looking at 3A, we are looking at mixed use, we are looking at an overlay. The Pleasant Street site hadn't come up. I'm surprised well, I guess the selectmen don't want that to be considered, but we have a lot of flexibility, I think, with 3A. The Situate Hill site we just approved is another, 8-acre parcel that could be put into that, and 15 units an acre. Someday somebody could develop 160 units there. So I just want to make sure that whatever we do with this interim thing, that it's not going to conflict with might ultimately come out in the actual bylaw. But the target for the bylaw would be the fall.
So the interim plan, the interim compliance plan is it's interesting the way they phrase it too. I am going through the exercise. I want the select board and the town, of course, to be on board on this. The way the state has phrased this, it's like they've authorized town officials to submit this. They're not requiring an official vote. They're not barring you to anything. They're not holding your feet to whatever you commit to. But they just want to make sure that towns and communities are engaging and doing this. And by filling this form out, you're not committing. You're just saying you're at least eligible for the funding programs in the meantime.
Yeah, and I think that's good. That's good to know. But I think a general consensus is we're focusing the efforts on 3A as opposed to other parts of town, unless we do, identify a really good parcel somewhere else in the town. But I think 3A is the logical choice. But
Well, and also area contiguous with the commuter rail station. But and Lauren, so you're making a presentation to the Board of Selectmen, and then they're gonna authorize you to put together this preliminary step.
Yes, well, I'm putting together the preliminary form to propose to them if they want to comment change. I'm sort of just my plan is to leave it generally that this is a general timeline. We would look to do these there's 5 key steps that they ask you to do: public engagement, the hearings, etc. You put a timeline on that, you sort of give a general idea of what you're going to do. But I think our general idea is that we have a couple of parcels on 3A. Here's a couple of example sites we're looking at. But the town will continue to look at this feasibility. And it's like, we need to leave it open-ended because right now we don't have concrete answers.
You want to keep a toe in the water. You don't want to say no, just because it's a little complicated, new, and some people might freak out with the concept, right? So you definitely want to keep a toe in the water, and to the extent that it's involved with land use planning, it's under your bailiwick as the director. And to the extent that the planning board can make a recommendation based on what you've presented to us for the Board of Selectmen to consider in their recommending that you move ahead as discussed, that doesn't hurt. In terms of the zoning bylaw committee, Tom, I think we're kind of early on that. It doesn't seem like there's a conflict per se. And the timeline gives us enough elbow room to
I'm just saying
make
that
good decisions and get good analysis before
I'm just
you make a
saying that
commitment to rezoning or doing an overlay district.
I'm just saying that the timing to this point has been to shoot for fall of 23. So,
And that's I don't see that as a conflict, but
I just don't want to have I don't want to have our hands tied in writing a bylaw by this interim thing, but now Lauren said we're not, so I'm not worried about it.
No, I mean, you could have a draft overlay.
There's ideas already out there, but it's like, what has to happen here in this one, other than with the other earlier permutations of a new bylaw, is that we have to comply with the density requirement, because this is denser than what our current zoning would allow. So we are going to have to set something out in the table of dimensional regulations that's special for this overlay wherever we create it.
I mean, I think you're jumping ahead to drafting zoning regulations when
yes, I am.
When we're really talking about policy, and to the extent that we can support the effort for the preliminary work that Lauren is doing and the considerations that the Board of Selectmen
I'm not in conflict with that at all. I just ultimately it's going to require a bylaw.
And to the extent that we have specific information in front of us that we can weigh in on, I think that just helps the Board of Selectmen know that we as an elected board are interested in what gets decided and are willing to weigh in in detail, which I think it helps them to some extent understand that they're not out there all by themselves.
Great. Will you have this interim plan? When do you think it would be done?
The interim plan?
Yeah.
Oh, tomorrow. It's quite simple. It's a
Oh,
simple
all right.
form.
No, I-
Just
It's
hit
a simple
button.
form.
I just-
I've just been
Focus.
reorganizing the.
No, I'm just thinking with the bylaw committee, adding it to our agenda on the 23rd of just looking at it.
Okay,
5 minutes to look at it and see what it is. So, you know, because after February, we're going to start thinking about the fall and we can start thinking. That's all, at this point, that's all we can do is start thinking about it. All right. Anything else about that? I mean, it's a lot of units.
Lauren, that's a very interesting thing, and it seems like it may make sense to try to comply, but keep our options open
right.
just in case. It seems like it's the elephant in the room at some point. I mean, in terms of the constituents of Cohasset, I think they expect their planning board to help make good decisions and not get us into anything that could cause us difficulty. Certainly, I mean, I think that this particular area around the commuter rail station, it is problematic in that it doesn't support extensive on-site septic systems. Like I think we looked at an example of a project a while back that's in a floodplain, and but we do know, and I don't know what the latest is, that there is a regional sewer plan that that might actually give us some extra sewer capacity. And I've said this many times. I really think the place for multifamily growth, the best place for multifamily growth for the town of Cohasset is within that half a mile or a quarter mile of the commuter rail station. That's the number one area, and this legislature initiative echoes that. I mean, the number two place that I've said for multifamily residential growth is the Village, but we don't really have a good connection yet. We're getting there in terms of the sidewalks on Sawyer Street, but it's still pretty tough to imagine commuters walking out of the Village up Sawyer Street down Route 3A to the train station. While it's possible, it seems like shuttle bus system might get that last mile and keep cars out of the parking lot. Or a bike lane. I see a lot of guys in the summer. I mean, guys meaning non-gender term, riding their bike to the train station, which is great.
I'll just add a Village stop on the commuter rail line.
Oh yeah, we were trying to get
Yeah,
that.
you guys
We were
want
trying to get that.
You guys want to open up rooms from 25 years ago.
The planning
30
board
years.
recommended that to the T.
I
and
know.
They picked another avenue.
No shortage of towns of larger, similar, or smaller size that have multiple stops on commuter rails.
I think a kiss and ride version for the Village would be great. That would be that's exactly where it's needed. Although it might take some of our desperately overtaxed parking spaces to make it happen. I just think it's a great idea. I don't know if we could get 8 cars along that area. Maybe before they built One Pleasant Street, they could have, but it'd be tough anyway.
I agree with Clark that near our station is the ideal spot, but let's not also forget the south end of 3A is another good candidate with parcels. And even though it's not in our town, it's in close proximity to the North Situate station.
That's true, yeah.
probably curry favor with the state. But let me ask Lauren this question, because one of the critiques of this legislation was it's kind of its one size fits all approach, and 600 zoning for 600 something units for a town that has 3,400. I mean, it's a giant percentage. Do you think there's any movement that this will get maybe more individualized at each city and town where we have, some more realistic numbers? If 600 got built all one fell swoop, obviously that would have a huge impact on the community in a number of respects. But I don't know. They still seem to be pursuing a one size fits all approach, and I don't know if that's appropriate. But
Yeah, so they have made the regulations more flexible and more attuned to, different communities. That's how we wound up with a smaller acreage for, our minimum area requirement. But what they did is, with the density requirement, they put in a circuit breaker so that no community exceeds 25% of their housing stock. But that was their answer to it. Other than that, because I even reached out, like I said, when I thought that figure was a wrong figure, and I spoke with them, and this is their final sort of. And I'm interested to see what over the next couple of years, as how many communities will come into compliance. I don't know that answer. And what will the state do if and when they find out that, the hammer of these through programs aren't working? What else will they add to it? I don't know.
I did see that they are hammering a few towns on their housing authority budgets already. So, and that's to me, that's the only real hammer they have over us, because we don't really qualify for the other grants. But I think that even though our housing authority property is small, any hit on their budget is probably devastating to them. So we have to be conscious of that. What else was I? Oh, would we be able to couple any of this with 40S? Because obviously, apartments will generate potentially more school children, and that's what 40S is designed to offset. Would we be able to do something in conjunction with 40S?
You would need to do a 40R smart growth zoning district, but to unlock the 40S capability, but yes.
So we could do we could frame the zoning as a 40R that complies with this housing choice initiative somehow. And then in the future, if need be, qualify for 40S funding.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be conscious of that too, because, Avalon never generated the number of school children that it was projected to, but also by agreement, Avalon limited everything to 2 bedrooms. And this zoning, we can't do that. We can't impose that. We might be able to get an agreement with a particular developer, but we can't impose it. So I think we should at least set ourselves up for that. If we need 40S funding help, that we set ourselves up for that in whatever we ultimately do. So we have to be conscious of that. All right.
Also, in relation to what you were saying about the 3A South section, because of the corridor study that we did almost 10 years ago now, the state decided that they were going to do a major upgrade to that section, which I think is on for next year.
It's pretty close to the final design.
I think they're just trying to get it in the budget for construction. It should be 100% documents. And
I think you're right.
It involves different turning, signalization, bike lanes and sidewalks on both sides, which really is the infrastructure needed to connect people into the businesses and the North Situate commuter rail station. And what's interesting is there's sidewalk, the sidewalk on the Henry Turner Bailey. I always want to say Beetle Bailey Road that goes into North Situate, except for the last 500 feet to 3A. And there may be some in putting it all together. There may be other aspects of the infrastructure that's planned and with the rezoning that could be important. to
Yeah.
work on a multi-town basis, and the state loves to give grants to communities that have infrastructure plans that go over town boundaries.
Another thing about the south stretch of 3A, there's always rumors of a particular piece of property for development behind the supermarket. So, there's development potential down there, and it's an opportunity for us to frame that development in a way that we might want to and be beneficial for the town as a whole. So, all right, anybody else with questions, comments? Anybody from the public have any questions or comments about this?
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren. That was really good. So we'll all watch you on the 10th too.
I'll be there.
All right. Does anybody want to discuss the master plan implementation committee? We discussed it a little the last time, and maybe we wait till we hear from town council about the scope of what the planning board can do about that.
That's fine with me to wait till we hear
Okay,
from council, but I
all right.
still think that the planning board takes a major role in the mass creation and adoption of a master plan, and the implementation, I think, should be no different.
Right, and so again, and I asked Lauren if we had what Katie Dugan, the former chair, had put together about their multi-year rollout of different initiatives. So we should be cognizant of that, because again, I think there's some sentiment amongst the select board that, oh, the master plan is done, it's being implemented. No, not fully, but a good chunks of it. But
We're,
right,
we're
so
here to
we'll-
remind them of that.
yes, well,
That's why we got elected.
We'll wait on that. So, all right, the only other update, the bylaw committee, we are meeting. We're having some very productive meetings. Judge Cutler has been great in helping us edit and write new articles. And just to update you, in the spring town meeting, we're going to work within the current framework of the bylaw. If we change chapters and move them around, that will come later when all the changes are made. So we are going to do updates and housekeeping for Articles 1, 3, 6, 8, and 12. The changes to Article 8, which is the non-conforming section of the non-conforming structures and lots, that will be done in 2 steps. One will be changes, mostly housekeeping. It's going to make it a little smaller and shorter. To the whole of Article 8, with our existing Cohasset version of the single lot exemption, and then there will be a separate article to amend the Cohasset version of the single lot exemption. So we'll take those in 2 pieces, and we've decided on the committee that we will have a forum on January 30th that will roll out the changes just for Section 8. Based on the fact that when we last discussed the single lot exemption, we did get some community involvement and pushback. So we think that should be addressed by itself. And then in February, we will roll out the other articles for initial presentation and to the community. Early on in the process, but early enough on that if we get some feedback for changes and things of that sort, we have the time to adapt to them. The Chapter 48, Section 5 hearings on all of the articles will come before the planning board in March. It may take 1 meeting, it may take 2 meetings. We'll just go with what we have to do. But we're making a lot of progress. We're meeting again the 9th. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to deal with changes to Articles 19 and 20, which is the wind and solar articles. So we're doing a lot of good work. Judge Cutler has been a great help. We are meeting again on the 9th. We're meeting again on the 23rd. We'll probably meet twice in February. We are also at the meeting, probably beginning on this Monday's meeting, the 9th, dealing with some definitions, Article 2. And again, I've said to the members of the bylaw committee, I'll say it to members of this committee, if there is any definition in our current bylaw that you think needs updating, changing, elimination, or a term that we don't have that we should add, now is the time to bring something up. Again, we're going to probably only deal with definitions that need some immediate attention, like the definition of height that we've talked about for over a year and a half. But if there are other things that you think need immediate attention, now would be the time to bring it up. Otherwise, other definitional changes are really going to be tied into what we do with the table of area regulations, the table of dimensional regulations, so they'll all come together in the fall when all of those changes, what changes that are proposed are in fact proposed. So that's our update. You know, we're operating with 5 members. We're getting a lot of good work out of everybody. And I guess town meeting is scheduled for May 1st tentatively. So that's, surprisingly, we have to operate fairly quickly because I think we have to submit these articles in February at some point. So that's the update from the bylaw committee. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Anybody else have any other update on things going on? Mr. Davis, I see you're still with us. Do you have any questions, comments?
Nope,
No? Okay.
nope, just observing.
Observing, okay. We can't see your face, though. We can't see you observing us, but
Which is okay. It's all right.
yeah, that's all right. Yeah. All right. Anybody else have anything they not anticipated 48 hours in advance they'd like to bring up?
No, should I make a motion to adjourn?
Yeah, I'll just again remind everybody, since we still have a couple of members of the public, 55 South Main Street will be dealt with on the 25th. That is our only public hearing at the moment, correct?
Correct.
And maybe then we'll take up some master plan issues on that day as well. The board will have a training by town council, as I said earlier, for how to do the 40A Section 5 hearings regarding the bylaw. That will come in one of our February meetings. So, Clark, you do have that motion.
You want a
One
second?
second.
Okay. All in favor of motion to adjourn?
Aye.
Aye.
Tom Kelly and I. Okay. Thank you all. Lauren, thank you. Angela, thank you. Thank you, members of the
Thanks,
public
guys.
listening.
See you next time.
See you next
Night.
time.